Bună dimineața, good morning. Thank you very much everyone for being here with us today. Hopefully we're going to have a nice interactive debate despite the wonderful atmosphere here in Râșnov, which has chased some of the audience away. But I'm sure we're going to have quite a numerous online audience. And we have four very distinguished panelists trying to discuss something that's just now starting to be discussed at European level, in particular in Central Eastern Europe, perhaps even more or with added interest. These panelists that are going to look into whether and how we can divest from China or reduce our dependence on China are Alexandra Martin, who is head of the Brussels office of Globsec. And Alexandra just recently organized a Central Eastern Europe China discussion whose very interesting conclusions, I'm sure she's going to walk us through. We also have with us Zsolt Darvas, who is an economist with Bruegel and with the Corvinus University in Budapest. He is also the author of one article that I can warmly recommend, which has been published. I think it's just a few days that we published it on our digital analysis platform, Eastern Focus. Zsolt's article is about whether Central Eastern Europe can benefit from the EU's push to reduce dependence on China. And his first findings, I'm not going to reveal too much, but are not necessarily very optimistic in that direction. We have also with us Yasen Georgiev, who's director of the Economic Policy Institute in Sofia, and we've had very interesting discussions with Yasen and his colleagues in the latest weeks regarding Chinese presence in Bulgaria and the extent to which China is influential in dominating, let's say, or in shaping the narrative in Bulgaria in a pro or anti-EU direction, depending on interest. And last but definitely not least, Andrei Cazacu, who is based in London, and he is with British American Business, and he's been very busy in recent times looking into the 5G dispute and the entire dynamics coming from the United States with regard to China to Europe, and probably also to some extent the other way. I'm just going to very briefly introduce the topic, and like I said, we're interested in finding out more today, probably not necessarily coming with the utmost solutions, but at least crafting some of the answers in a way that might lead us to a solution eventually, into what's happening with the entire Europe-China debate and relationship post-COVID-19, or not really post-COVID-19, because we have the luxury here in Râșnov being in the open air of not having to wear a mask, but we're not exactly post-pandemic. But one of the early things that we discovered during this pandemic is to what an extent the European Union and Europe in general are dependent on China in some very important ways, and in some industries that happen to reveal themselves as being critical at times of need. The discussion on China is not new. It's been going on for at least a few years, sorry, and at least ever since the Trump administration has started pressuring China and treating it as a competitor, as a very serious competitor to the United States worldwide, especially in matters of trade, but also geopolitics. Europe has been more hesitant in jumping into the debate with any clear positioning, but ever since the past few months and the coronavirus pandemic, China has taken front place in the European debate as well, specifically with our high dependence on the supply chains that originate in Beijing, but also in terms of geopolitics with 5G, with Huawei, with everything that regards Chinese influence. And if China was perceived, at least in Central Eastern Europe, as less of an active presence, especially an active malign presence, than Russia, in the past few months, and we've had several studies, evidence published by the European Union, but also by numerous think tanks across the region in Europe that show that China is actually quite an influential presence, one to reckon with in the region and beyond, also in terms of shaping the public agenda and the public debate. So these are the things that we're trying to wrap our heads around for the next 1 hour and a half. And I'm just gonna start with Alexandra Martin and asking all of the speakers, if possible, to try and keep their kickoff remarks brief and provocative, because we're trying to, first of all, find out where we should start the debate. How should we look at these things? And Alexandra, from your recent experience in Brussels, but also in the region, where should this debate about China start in Europe?
Good morning, everyone from Brussels. Thank you, Juana, and the Global Focus Center for the invitation. It's great to be back at the Râșnov Festival, even if second year and online. I think that we will have a bit of a mission impossible to pack up or to pack everything into an hour and a half on EU-China, on China globally, on US, EU-China triangle. But let me have a few initial thoughts about also our recent discussion with Central and Eastern European partners and their expectations towards how EU-China agreement should look like in the future. And it's important to mention that, as you said, the deterioration of this relationship has been going on since before COVID-19 pandemic, but has been accelerated tremendously by COVID. And as Hemingway said once, it started getting worse gradually and then suddenly. So the 5 points that I would like to have are related to the following aspects. The Chinese presidency in CE has been very much at the forefront of the relationship between EU-China, or the discussions about this relationship. And what is important to mention is that CE cannot be seen as a unique or unified actor when it comes to the approach towards China. So we do have different opinions, experiences, and visions. And what is also important is that maybe across the board, with 1 or 2 exceptions, the 17+1, the Belt and Road Initiative 17+1 framework has not actually yielded the results or the expectations that the countries had at the very beginning when they started the engagement process with China. So that would be one point. The secondly, CE has been seen a bit of a Trojan horse when it comes to China. And it's seen as the way into Europe. So this is an idea that CE, what we see around is that CE asked for this to be dismissed. It cannot be generalized that the CE countries are the Trojan horses when it comes to EU-China relationship, and the new narrative needs to be constructed. The third point, and that was a very interesting that was raised, is that 17+1 seems to still have brought some experience in negotiating or dealing with China. And the expectation from the region is that this could be an opportunity for Brussels to take advantage of this experience and try to learn from CE on how to further the cooperation in the future. So that's a valuable insight on what the region has learned. Fourth point, the engagement with China needs to be done in cooperation at the European level and, of course, with the transatlantic partners. And that's actually one of the key questions that I hope we will touch upon, because the current relationship between Brussels and Washington, D.C. is quite at a low level. And I don't see any opportunity to change that, at least until the elections, which at the end of the day is taking place just in a matter of weeks. So I do agree with this formulation that an EU-China agreement needs to be somehow framed or underpinned by a transatlantic relationship. And lastly, the thing that struck me the most, and I think it's a very interesting conversation to have, is how the region sees the engagement with China moving forward. And that's a matter of strategic importance from the political, economic, but also value-based angles. So most CE countries still want to have the freedom of having bilateral relationships. So structuring their relationship both at the bilateral level, but then also at the European level. Well, this, I'm afraid, at times will become impossible because the size matters, and we are not dealing with a mid power. We are talking about one of the great powers today, and competing interests between national interest and European interest will be highlighted if we pursue this type of dual track approach when it comes to China. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to develop further as we move into the conversation.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And since you mentioned the temptation for some countries to have bilateral relations with China, I would like to go to Yasen now, because Bulgaria is one of the countries that has taken an interest in developing a relationship with China. I'm not sure how successful you see this relationship to be at this point, Yasen, because the experience, I think, in a lot of regional countries within and outside of the European Union is that a lot has been discussed, but much less has actually happened from the Chinese side. And I wonder if you have an assessment of how well that relationship has played for Bulgaria so far. Was it rather to Bulgaria's advantage, both economically and politically? Was it detrimental? And how do you feel, what do you feel are the lessons learned so far in Sofia?
Thank you, Oana. Firstly, bună dimineața to our colleagues in Romania. Do you hear me?
We had some very slight interruptions, but I think we can hear you fine.
Ok, bună dimineața and mulțumesc pentru invitație. Good morning to everyone and greetings from Sofia. I'm very happy to be among the distinguished speakers this morning in the panel discussing China's influence in the region. And what I could share is how things look like from a Bulgarian perspective. So when we speak about China's presence in the country, we have to say, unlike other countries in the wider Southeast Europe region, we have still a very limited Chinese presence in terms of we have a very extremely limited investments coming from China to Bulgaria. Second, there is no notable activity in the field of infrastructure coming from a China-owned company. And third, in terms of tourism, we have almost no growth in terms of visitors coming to the country from China. But by saying this, I don't mean that there is no interest on behalf of China-owned companies. And our recent history shows the stories of several Chinese projects that actually failed at the end of the day. Firstly, it was the Chinese automotive producer Great Wall. That's the assembling point in northern Bulgaria with the ambition to enter the European automotive market by starting to assemble cars. But actually that initiative, that project had to close after several years of operation. A second more notable attempt was for Chinese investment in the field of agriculture that was entirely meant to export.
I think we're losing.
That one was, of course, in the... Can you hear me right now?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, so I was saying that there are a couple of stories about the attempts of Chinese companies to enter the market, and the thing is that unlike other countries in Southeastern Europe, we have a very limited economic activity on behalf of Chinese companies in the country. When it comes to infrastructure, because I think it's the most active field where China is playing in the region. Bulgaria.
I'll try to jump to Zsolt Darvas while we restore the connection with Yasen, and perhaps I mean Yasen for sure will go back to you after the initial round of kickoff remarks. Zsolt, so if I understand correctly what Yasen is saying, it's essentially that there's one of the perhaps essential reasons why there isn't so much active presence of China in Central Eastern Europe is that the actual capacity of Central Eastern Europe to produce projects that would be large enough to be interesting for China might just not be there. We are still somehow economies that are very centered on exports to the Western European market. So perhaps whatever Chinese interests happen to be projected in our region might also come through the Western European market. Referring perhaps also to the recent piece that we've published and that you authored, what is your take on where the Central Eastern Europe-China relationship might stand from an economic point of view?
First of all, I would also like to thank you for inviting me here. It's a great honor and pleasure, and so far the contributions have been very, very interesting. I also share many of the views that have been said before. I come more from an economic perspective and look at the EU or Central Europe-China relationship from that perspective. And one hope of politicians from the region in Central Eastern Europe that the COVID crisis will lead to a reorientation of global production and value chains, namely bringing production from China to Central Europe. You know, at the first sight, that might sound quite sensible because Central European countries are much closer to Germany and France and Italy than China. So if any other trade disruption would happen in the future, then it should be easier to to manage trade within Europe than managing trade from another continent which is several miles away. But there are a number of arguments which suggest me that this is not very likely to happen. And I would like to discriminate between two issues, a small issue and a real big issue. And the small issue is a kind of strategic independence from China in terms of some critical products, like, for example, face masks and ventilators were missing from Europe in the height of the COVID crisis in March. And we have to ship them in from China. They arrived later. The quality was not always good. And that caused major problems. So on this, and this is the smaller part, I do think that for these some specific strategic issues, again, like face masks and ventilators, the EU will find ways to produce more within Europe to avoid certain supply side risks if such materials would be needed in the future. But this is a very, very small part of total trade, and a much bigger part comprise of various kind of products, most notably manufacturing products. And I think that the hope that a large share of this manufacturing will come from China to Central Europe is very, very unlikely to happen. And let me just mention a few risks and a few reasons, and then I will stop. Now, first of all, if you look at trade flows, then what we see is that trade declined from China much less than from Central Europe. Let me give you some numbers. If you look at the imports of the first 15 European Union member states, Germany, Italy, also the UK, and so on, then imports from Central Europe declined by more than 1/3. So more than 1/3 of import has gone in April this year compared to last year. By the decline from China was less than half of that. And even by April, imports from China fully recovered to the level where it was before. So clearly the disruption coming from China was much, much smaller than the disruption coming from Central Europe. And this altogether suggests that, importing intermediate inputs from China is not so unreliable after all. Also, China was able to handle the COVID crisis relatively fast. Just there were some news reports that in Wuhan, from where the whole infection started, they had, a huge party with thousands of people gathering together without any problems. While, in Europe, we are still struggling with the second wave of the pandemic. So, in fact, China was even much more effective in managing and handling the crisis than Europe. So, from a purely trade perspective, it's not very likely that suppliers will move from China to Central Europe. But there are also some other issues because the region is very, very small. I mean, you also indicated in your question. So even if you combine all Central European countries, they are much, much smaller than, the broader China area, which also include, neighboring countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and so on. And certain products are almost fully produced there. For example, if you look at an iPhone and many other mobile phones, even Nokia phones are even produced in China, the whole value chain is in Asia. So if Central Europe would like to get a small part, it would mean that they are getting much farther away from where the other suppliers are. It is very, very unlikely, in my view, that the whole production chain would move to Europe. The region is simply not large to that. So for these reasons, in my view, it's not very likely that a significant shift will emerge after the crisis, the pandemic, except, as I said, for some few smaller issues like face masks and ventilators will be certainly produced in Europe in a much greater scale. But this is a very small part of trade, and the bigger part, I'm afraid, will continue to depend a lot on China in the future.
Thank you, Zsolt. So I think your conclusion is crystal clear, and that is we're not going to see too much changing in terms of the European dependence on China. On a different level, though, and I'm turning now to Andrei, Cazacu. There is a lot of pressure from the United States, at least in terms of 5G and working with Huawei and preparing for the 5G technology adoption in European countries, that is producing effects already. There's a lot more alignment behind the U.S. call to not work with China in this respect, because of issues of trust in a private company that still seems to have its buttons with the Beijing authorities. And there's from Northern Europe to the UK to Greece to Romania, multiple countries in Europe have already made their decision not to work with Huawei, although it really remains to be seen, and that is what at least telecoms companies are saying, how exactly this is going to happen in technical terms, since a lot of the infrastructure is already dominated by Huawei for what we are using right now. So Andrei, since your line of work is very much along these lines of US-UK interactions with regard to 5G and China, what is your feeling, if you can zoom out a little bit and give us sort of the global perspective of what's happening at the intersection of American and, on the other hand, Chinese interests?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me on the panel today. I hope the connection and the audio are good.
Yep.
And I just wanted to make the point that I am, like, what I'm saying today are my views, and not I'm not speaking as in my British American business capacity. Indeed, it's I think the telecoms issue is slightly different than the supply chains issue that COVID-19 have brought to the surface. It is it's really interesting, and I could speak about it for hours, but I'll try to keep it extremely brief. The US has been anxious about Huawei in particular for a long time. I think it's been about 15 years that they've been monitoring and trying to see where it goes. And only in the past couple of years has there been sort of some pretty significant, there have been significant developments on that front. And undoubtedly, the whole anti-Huawei push across Europe is driven by the US. And I think without the US, we just wouldn't be in the position that we are right now. The US angle is very much a national security angle, and they're concerned that the new architecture of 5G, which is very different from previous generations, exposes telecom networks to new vulnerabilities. And probably one of the main arguments that Washington has been making is that the Chinese Communist Party could use Huawei, given the blurred lines between the private sector and the public sector, to sort of spy on Western countries and even sabotage them. Now, I don't know how persuasive that has been. I haven't seen that much evidence from Washington to suggest that, but there is a more compelling point on this, which is that sort of what happens when sort of country X does something to displease the CCP. Is the Chinese Communist Party in a position to tell Huawei to sort of either turn off national networks or tinker with them in an extreme situation, of course? And there's been a lot of talk about the Chinese National Security Law of 2015 as a mechanism to do just that. So I think it's whatever you make about the Trump administration and their approach to Huawei, I think there are some good arguments for their approach to Huawei. That being said, I think the main issue is to understand what is at stake more in a broader sense, and that is that the 5G technology is just the benefits and the opportunities that the developers promise go way beyond what 4G brought. We know it's not going to be just about having faster speeds on your smartphone to download music or videos. It's the main applications that everyone is excited about are industrial things like industrial IoT, boosting efficiencies in manufacturing, automating processes, and this is so businesses will be the main beneficiary in the immediate term of 5G. And there's quite a lot at stake here. The whole race to 5G. I'm sure a lot of people have been reading articles about who's leading, who's winning the race, who's losing the race, and there's anxiety across Europe that we are somehow losing this race.
Can I just very, very quickly interrupt you to ask you something? Because there's in another interview that we published just a few weeks ago in Eastern Focus with Samir Saran from the Observer Research Foundation in India, which sees itself at least to some extent as a competitor to China, and again at least regionally. one of the main arguments he was making was that trust is going to become an essential currency in international relations as well as in economic and trade relations. So the argument was that unless you can trust the partners that you're going to be working with, especially on sensitive issues where it's all about intimate details, about your private data, about your health data, about things that you communicate about with people that you speak with over the phone or online, then trade relations are going to be affected in a major way in the future by whether you can trust that partner or not. And then choices are going to be made whether to work with China or not on the basis of that. Do you agree? Do you feel that beyond issues of cost and the generally good conditions that Huawei provides technically and in terms of pricing, is trust going to start mattering more in how both Central Europe and others make their decisions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's definitely true that over the past sort of 5 or 6 months, we've seen countries sort of change their attitudes towards China because they simply didn't trust how China may have handled the health crisis. And sort of this is one of the things that I was alluding to. If you can't trust that your partner is reliable, that kind of changes your calculations about things like critical infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, I haven't fully gone through the interview that you mentioned, so I can't really comment on that. But I think what I was trying to get at earlier is that sort of Huawei, just because of their relationship with the Chinese state and all the subsidies that they've been receiving, sort of the competition angle is probably, I would say, top of mind for a lot of U.S. companies, and the fact that they've been receiving so many subsidies and their equipment is so cheap, kind of makes it harder to look at alternatives. Not sure what else to add on the trust point, though.
Right. No. Thank you very much. I think I would like to address the same question to Alexandra. If I can reveal just a little bit of the discussion that I participated in at your invitation between experts in Central Eastern Europe and experts and officials in Brussels about China. My feeling was that it was quite widespread among the experts that the 16+1 and currently 17+1 format has not really yielded much, just as Yasen was pointing out about Chinese presence in Bulgaria. So I had the feeling that pretty much everybody was saying, we've tried, we've failed, there's not much that's coming out of that. And overall, Central Eastern Europe has experimented with China in ways that Brussels was not always happy with. But the overall conclusion of that experiment is rather negative. We didn't get much out of it, so we should essentially ditch it and act in a more unified fashion. Would you say that there's a loss of trust in China in Central Eastern Europe? Or, is economic opportunism still going to be more important, as discussed earlier with Andrei? Issues of cost and availability of technology are going to trump issues of trust, and that's just going to be for the farther future.
That's a very interesting way of putting it, Juana. And I am not really sure that trust was the defining element of the relationship between CEE and China. I think it was driven by economic interest and the potential seen to diversify and to have alternatives. Also, when the relationships with Brussels were not necessarily going in the direction that was preferred or wanted from CEE. So overall, I think that there is disappointment. I also think that the perception or the attitudes of CEE countries towards China will be shaped by two elements. One, to what extent their interests and their views and their voice will be properly showcased in the final agreement between EU and China, and to make sure, or Brussels to take into account the needs, the regional positioning, the market structure, and everything else that's coming from Central and Eastern Europe, and also non-EU countries, because at one point that will be interconnected. And on the other hand, I'm not an economic, I'm not a tech expert necessarily, but I do deal with geopolitical issues. And the relationship, the strong bond between Central and Eastern Europe and the US will be the second defining element of how the countries in our region will relate to China. And it's important to mention the recent visit of State Secretary Pompeo and the messages that were sent, in addition to, of course, the discussions on the military redeployments from Germany into Poland. So I think that the CE will be very careful in ensuring that their footing or their relationship, both when it comes to EU and when it comes to Washington, will be at the forefront of how they will continue to engage with China. And at the end of the day, I don't have the data, but our region has been developing thanks to cohesion funds, thanks to economic opportunities coming from the EU, Western European partners, and also from the United States. Maybe Juana, I would make one more point, and that's to get a conversation even further. One of the critics, and it came not just as from our discussion, but also I see it more and more. The EU defined China both as a partner, as a competitor, as a strategic rival, and so on. So the new discussion is you can't really have them all in one package. We will need to be able to better define the type of engagement. We will need China, as High Representative Borrell mentioned, on the issues of climate change. We do need China when it comes to our multilateral frameworks of engagement and the so-called global order. But we will need to make sure that everything related to the human rights record, everything related to unfair or lack of market access, and also the selected view of multilateralism that has come from Beijing will be addressed moving forward.
Thank you, Alexandra. And because I'm getting questions already from the audience, I'm going to refer to something that you mentioned and throw the question out to all the speakers, perhaps particularly to Andrei, who I know has to leave us in about a quarter of an hour. And the question that's coming is, how much of the current American skepticism towards Huawei is specific to the current administration, and how much of it represents a wider concern shared across the political spectrum? In other words, is the U.S. position towards Huawei likely to change if there is a change of administration in Washington, or is it likely that the U.S. is going to continue making the same type of pressures?
That is the million-dollar question. In a broader sense, because I've been trying to understand what a Biden administration would mean for sort of global trade in general, I don't get the sense that there would be a fundamental change in how U.S. approaches things should Biden take office. There might be, I'm actually almost convinced that there will be a clear change in tone towards American allies, towards Europe, towards NATO. But when it comes to the fundamental issues such as protecting American industries, the whole steel tariffs, and also telecoms particularly, I think as I was saying before, the anxiety in Washington about Huawei and about China's tech sector in particular is not a new thing. It's not a Trump administration issue. It's been going on for more than a decade. So I don't necessarily expect that to change. But like I said, I think probably a Biden administration would use more carrot than stick when it comes to talking to its partners across Europe about it.
Mm-hmm. If unless any of the speakers wants to add anything on this issue specifically, because that basically takes us back to how is Europe going to react to any pressure coming from the United States. I'm also interested in looking at something else that Alexandra briefly touched upon, and Yasen, perhaps you can help us figure this one out, which is China also trying to sell more than just its commodities to Europe, and particularly to the Central Eastern European countries, also outside of EU borders, and that is its authoritarian illiberal model. And how efficient is it in doing so? Because our recent the surveys that we've looked at following the first 2 months of pandemic have shown very worrying results with respect to how much buy-in there is to the Chinese narrative across the region, including in Bulgaria, where increasing numbers were actually believing that the virus is made in a U.S. lab potentially, that it was China and not the European Union that jumped to the rescue of regional countries at the first phase of the pandemic, and so on and so forth. So narratives that are very likely to make it harder for countries in the region to actually continue working in a unified way with Brussels, let alone with Washington.
So, Juana, if you can hear me now, I
Yes.
would like to jump in and try to answer the question. And if you allow me, I'm going to switch off my camera in order to ensure the proper quality
Sure.
of my voice. So I'm just willing to quickly summarize what I was saying in my previous intervention. And the thing is that it is less likely to hear about a Chinese company to do a big infrastructure project in Bulgaria, but it is highly likely to see a Chinese company to be chosen as a subcontractor within EU-funded project. And I'm saying this because we are observing a growing activity of a Chinese company who already established a branch in the country. It is the China Communication Construction Company. And this company is obviously trying to expand in the country by hiring experts in public procurement. And the company is already involved in 3 public tenders, which shows that it is very much likely that we are going to have a situation that we observe in Croatia when it comes to the big bridge that is being built between Dubrovnik and the mainland. So I suppose that it will be something that is going to be a real fact in the next year. So it will be a Chinese company that is going to work with European money. So it of course I could prove wrong, but we have all the foundation to think that this growing activity is going to result into such kind of involvement of Chinese companies. Also because of the fact that this company donated self-protection equipment to Sofia municipality during the peak of the COVID crisis in the country. And they used this very carefully in order to inform the public about what is the size of this donation and how it meets the needs of the capital city of Bulgaria. But let me be back quickly on your question and try to figure out what is the acceptance of China in the country. Actually, there are not many studies showing what is the public sentiment about China. But luckily, we were involved in a study done by the International Republican Institute and the Fondation pour l'Innovation Politique in France. And that study was published last year. And surprisingly enough, it shows that Bulgaria has the lowest share of people in the European Union who consider China's behavior on the international stage as worrying. It is 19%, while in the EU, 40% of the people consider that the Chinese behavior is worrying. And on the contrary, Bulgaria has also the highest share of people who consider that China plays a reassuring role on the international stage. And it is the highest share in the European Union, which shows that China has already somehow paved the way for its acceptance in the country. And obviously, the narratives that are dominating here are very much in favor of China. Of course, we cannot say whether the COVID-19 crisis has been impacting these narratives, but we could easily say that all media that are playing with pro-Chinese narratives, they are more or less linked to media or to media owners that are pro-Russian, which shows that the Chinese influence is trying to play the card of the pro-Russian media by blaming the European Union and the Western liberal order as something that is failing apart. And we think that although the fact that nowadays China is playing a very low profile here in the country, we have a very strong foundation for Chinese companies and for Chinese influence to bounce back maybe after the COVID crisis.
Thank you for mentioning that, and let me give you some more numbers. These are part of an ongoing study, so I am bound by confidentiality at this point as to who we're doing it with, but I will just quote a few of the numbers that have resulted from surveys, and that is. I'll tell you the numbers for Bulgaria, for instance. 64% of Bulgarians believe that China is a reliable economic partner. In Greece, that number is 67%. In Serbia, it's 76%. We have numbers such as 55% in Moldova who believe that China is also a reliable political partner. And similar numbers in the Balkans and Serbia with the whopping 73%. We have in Bulgaria 41% who believe the West is trying to discredit the role of China in improving infrastructure and transportation. And 64% who believe that Chinese investments create jobs and opportunities that benefit Bulgarians. And we have similar numbers across the region, both within the European Union and outside of the European Union. And I would like to come back to the topic of how extensive has been the Chinese awakening to the fact that they need to also win hearts and minds in response to the US push in Europe. But that is immediately after asking Andrei one last question, because I know he needs to go, and that is especially given the context of Brexit, can you give us some insight into how the UK is looking at the relation with China, since we're discussing a lot about the European Union, but how is this seen from the UK? How do they feel about their relationship with China?
Sure. I think the short answer is no one knows, and I think the UK itself doesn't necessarily know. One of the points of Brexit is that UK wanted to sort of find a new course for itself, a new role globally. And I think we've seen over the past couple of years that there's been a lot of pressure from Washington and in so many ways for the UK to sort of follow their lead. This has obviously meant a U-turn on the Huawei ban, because the UK government decided not to ban it and then change course. And there's a few other issues where that's also happened. It's really hard to tell. I think the main point is that the UK needs to really define its new role in the world, and then we can talk about what its relationship and sort of approach to China will be. So far, I think it's shown, at least in the past couple of years, like I said, that it's just taking cues from Washington. Whether that will change with a new administration, or it'll be just more of the same. Should there be a returning Trump administration? That's a big question mark. But yeah. I'm the only one, but I can't really hear what.
Oh, and let me repeat it in a nutshell. The question is, can we wait for others, European operators, to catch up with the Huawei technology when 5G is essentially a tool for progress? Is it realistic these days, economically speaking, that we're just going to give up the benefit of using something right now and just postpone it until we manage to develop the same capabilities?
Yeah, this is something that I was trying to allude to in my introductory remarks. I think that's it's a bit misleading. There's this narrative that Huawei is miles ahead of everyone on 5G technology, and I just don't think the data and sort of the facts support that. I think there are a lot of companies that have worked. It's a really complicated process of developing these technologies, and companies actually work together to do it. Companies like Ericsson and Nokia, among many others, have been at the forefront of this. I think the main impediment when you see countries complaining that they can't replace technology, or it's just so complicated, is the cost, which was I was alluding to. Huawei is capable of undercutting. Ericsson and Nokia, not so much. So their gear is just more expensive. The technology is not. I don't think it's not worse. It's still part of the same global standard that is agreed on, that is 5G. So again, it really comes down to cost, and it comes down to what the EU will decide to do. Will it decide to similarly support its sort of champions? Whether Ericsson or Nokia or a completely new company. We've also seen Washington discuss the same things. There's a bit of anxiety there that they don't have a similar company to Ericsson, Nokia, or Huawei. So yeah, those are the big questions. Mm-hmm. Will there be an American champion like Huawei? Will there be a European decision on that? And so far, I'm sorry to say, I think that Europe hasn't decided what it wants to do and how it wants to do that. But on the fundamental question, we do have Western companies that can step in, and they have stepped in many countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Andrei, and for being with us today also. And Zsolt, I would like to ask you if you have any further insights into this. Do you get a feeling that the EU has or the member states have a more or less clear idea of how to support the development of cost-efficient solutions that are European rather than Chinese? And in that sense, is there also any sort of meaningful discussion that you know about as to how to offset the losses, the potential losses for telecom companies and others that are using Huawei technology if we try to divest from China and Huawei? Can you hear us, Zsolt?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So let me mention a quite landmark German decision. When there was a Chinese company wanted to buy up one of the leading technology German firms, then there was a decision in Germany which prohibited that investment and that buy-up. And that decision was motivated by, indeed, supply security motivations. You also see that in France and in many other countries, the issue of screening foreign FDI has become much more important. In about half of the European Union countries, there are national institutions and national laws which allow to block a certain foreign takeover of domestic companies in case of strategic interest. But at the European level, there was no such agreement whether the EU would introduce such an instrument for the whole single market. So in this sense, I also share Andrei's view that the EU is not, fully decided, first of all, on protecting critical and critical industries, and also on particularly on what to do with 5G. It's evolving technology. I also agree that Nokia and Ericsson are in the forefront. So I'm afraid we still will be in this somewhat undecided position for quite some time. But we do see the more and more tendencies for screening foreign investments and getting more autonomy in some strategic industries. And I expect this just to continue in the years to come.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this, and I now realize that I forgot to mention that I appropriated essentially questions from the audience without mentioning that they were questions from the audience. So it wasn't me asking intelligent questions, but others. And so I'm going to continue with yet another question that came earlier, and that I think any one of you who has any insights into this, it's very much welcome. And the idea is that we've been focusing so much on what Europe does, on what the US is doing, Central Eastern Europe. But how about China? Because China is also aware of all the discussions that we're having across the transatlantic space. And we've seen that we've seen the reaction to the initial, let's say, China bashing mood at the beginning of the pandemic, where everybody was looking to China and blaming China for the virus. And we've seen quite a quick and strong, I don't know how efficient, reaction from China trying to fight back. How about how China is fighting back the entire discussion about reducing our dependence on Beijing? Do we have the elements to give an answer? Is there a change in both discourse and attitude and policy on the Chinese side? Alexandra, Yasen, Zsolt, if you have any insight into this.
I will take it up. I'm not a China expert, but I'll try to give some insights of what I see from the geopolitical side. But before that, I want to make a point on what Zsolt said a bit earlier, that there is no EU idea, or at least Brussels consensus on how we move forward. And I actually disagree with you. I think that it's not about the Brussels consensus, because at the end of the day, the Brussels consensus means the consensus of the member states. And there are a lot of national interests that still need to come together. So it's not just Commissioner Vestager or President Ursula von der Leyen agreeing on it. And what we have seen or what we expect, at least for the rest of the year, is exactly the consolidation of screening and public procurement acts to ensure that at any moment, if concerns are coming from other countries towards investments, FDIs, or other forms in Central and Eastern Europe, the partners could actually ask or can block it temporarily or could ask for additional information. So I think that there is quite some movement when it comes to EU or internal market screening and procurement system. And then everything that has been moving on the digital front, from the AI white paper to the Digital Services Act that is currently in public consultation, and so on and so forth. So I think until the end of this year, we will see quite big developments when it comes to EU legislation that is somehow aligned to the idea of more strategic autonomy, not just from the defense and security side, but across the sectors. When it comes to the Chinese reaction to what's happening in Brussels, and this is something that we see at least from the way the engagement works, it is very interesting that as we speak, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is touring Western European capitals. He has been in Italy just a couple of days ago. Italy is a bit of an outlier on how at least Western European countries are perceiving China, and we saw in the media that there are new commercial accords and infrastructure projects planned between Italy and China as part of 17+1. But overall, I think that there is a big awareness in Beijing that the European countries at least are somehow pulling out or are way more careful on how the relationship will move forward. And that is influenced by the US. And what we have seen, what I have read, is that their narrative or their position is that EU should, or the relationship between EU and China has nothing to do with the relationship between US and China, which is absolutely not the case because of the strong transatlantic bond that we have developed in decades. So there is a charming, I think, offensive in ensuring that the EU is able to carry out its own relationships by not being squeezed in between the US and China growing tensions. So we will. I don't know numbers. I'm not really. I don't think that we have data coming from China on how they calculate scenarios and courses of action based on the steps that will be taken either by Brussels or by Washington. But there seems to be more engagement and more reframing of the conversation on the issues that China and the EU need to work on, particularly on climate change and on the reform of the multilateral institutions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alexandra, and I would like to ask Zsolt, Zsolt, if you have any feeling both that there is a change in dynamics coming from the Chinese side. Do you feel that China, and perhaps not just now, but over the past few years, and especially since the Trump administration has taken aim at the relationship with Beijing, do you feel that the Chinese thinking is evolving in terms of how to steer the economic relation with Europe? And also, if you have any feelings related to whether the current European Commission that defines itself as being more geopolitical has so far behaved in ways that indicate that it is indeed going to act more geopolitically, including on trade and the economy.
Yeah, thank you. Let me briefly respond to Alexandra. I mean, the public procurement you mentioned is a very, very particular issue and certainly important issue. What I was referring to is that there was no agreement on the European Union-wide foreign investment screening mechanism. As I said, half of the countries have such a mechanism in place, the individuals within the country themselves, of course. The other half of the countries in the European Union do not have, and they couldn't find an agreement, member states couldn't find an agreement for an overall European approach to that. And I think this indeed indicates that views across member states differ on how to treat foreign investment. And still, if you just focus on China, some countries still very much favors Chinese investment. I mean, I can also refer to my home country, Hungary. For example, a Chinese company with help with the state loans now building a big railway between Belgrade and Budapest. Now the Commission approved that railway plan, but many experts question the usefulness and also the costs related to that. So indeed, I just would like to emphasize that in some countries, still China is seen as a partner to diversify, to reduce dependence from Western European countries, while in other countries, China is more seen as a threat. Now, concerning the transatlantic relationship and also the U.S.-China, again, on one of the previous points, if you look at before Trump, so U.S. attitudes toward China before Trump, then there were many reports, many discussions, also U.S. government reports showing that China plays in an unfair way, stealing technology, forcing U.S. companies and also other companies from the rest of the world investing in China to share technology with the local Chinese companies. There were a lot of concerns about state and so on, and so this suggests that there are much deeper rooted concerns in the United States towards China than what President Trump himself expressed very vividly. And coming to the European Union, I do see similar concerns, but the European approach is always much more diplomatic and much more gradual than the US approach. I mean, in the US, Trump just announces something on Twitter, and then a few days later, with the help of the Congress, they pass some tariffs and other legislations and so on. While in Europe, the approach has always been more on negotiating, trying to convince China and so on. And also, Europe is also in a very delicate position and difficult position. Hello, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Europe is still in a very difficult position in this triangle of US, China, and Europe, because in some issues, certainly our views are much more closer to the United States than to China. And I would say in most issues, certainly the transatlantic ties are much more stronger. But also some issues when we have more commonality with China, and the two most prominent ones. One is the global governance. Europeans much more believe in a rule-based global governance framework than the United States, and China seems to be supporting that. And a very particular and top issue is climate change. European views to climate change are much closer to China than to the United States. So Europe always have to find a delicate balance when it deals with both transatlantic and East Asian relations, because some of our interests are more aligned with China, even though culturally and in many other factors we are much closer to the United States.
Thank you, Zsolt, for your insights and to come back to an earlier point that Yasen was making that I was thinking about while you were speaking. Yasen, you mentioned at some point that some of the Chinese entry points, at least into the kind of them, at least for Chinese messaging in Bulgaria, I wanted to say, are the same as the Russian entry points, and that there is and that the domestic stakeholders that China works with in Bulgaria are also the same stakeholders that work with Russia in Bulgaria. And I'm curious if the Chinese presence in Bulgaria and the Chinese push, if any, for further development of relations with Bulgaria, also mirror what Russia does, in the sense of, and this is another question that I got here from the audience, is China, like Russia very much, trying to also sell the anti-EU, anti-Western narrative wherever it seeks to project its economic influence? Or is it satisfied to just project a more China-friendly narrative? What is your feeling?
So I'm again going to switch off my camera. As I mentioned, these media channels are either owned by the very same persons who transmit pro-Russian narratives, and these media channels are also trying to polish the picture of China in the world as a kind of solution which combines the very best of the two worlds. Like we have the Chinese capitalism, which includes a high economic growth, but at the same time, it is a sign of a society that has a very, how to say, strong foundation in terms of local legislation. It might sound confusing, but many studies show that majority of Bulgarians are very much in favor of a strong man to govern the country, rather than to have a division of powers, to have a parliament, a judiciary, and executive working separately. So when people look at China, they see a strong hand. They see that the level of daily crime is really low, and this is something that sounds very appealing to people who have a very low level of trust in public institutions. In Bulgaria, this is a general issue. I mean, the lack of trust in institutions. And when people think about how the government is performing, they usually try to find good examples for efficient governance. And usually it is the governance that is the case in Russia or in China, where you have a very unified approach coming top down rather than bottom up. And this is something that I think could be explained with the socialist past, when people were used to have a single source of power. And because of the failures of the democratic transition in the country, many people were very much in favor of such kind of rosy picture of China or Russia. But at the same time, we have to be also very pragmatical, and majority of Bulgarians might be in favor of the way Russia or China are governed, but at the same time, they work, live, and study in Western Europe. So at the end of the day, I think people are choosing with their feet, and they're choosing in favor of the Western way of living, which makes people decide which one would be the better narrative. And of course, you can say that China is about to win the battle about the hearts and minds of people here, but still they don't envision themselves to be living in a country like China or like Russia. And I think it is a battle that is going to last for years. I mean, the short-term economic benefits from being in the EU and the long-term appeal of having a governance structure that is much more like Russian or Chinese style. But we have to bear in mind that Bulgaria, being at the geographical periphery of the European Union, is being targeted by external actors that try to show that the European Union is not performing in the best possible way. And they are trying to weaken the image of the EU by targeting its external members. So it is something that is not only the case, I think, in Bulgaria, but also in other countries that are very much located into the periphery of the European Union. And the thing that China is trying to have bilateral relations with all the countries is something that we have to limit to the extent that we can. Since we see that China is very active in Greece, it is also active in Italy, and having this approach of separating the countries from their European position is something that we have to avoid at any cost. Actually, it was the approach that Russia has been implementing when it comes to energy dependency of Eastern Europe. They try to play with all the single countries, but the fact is that no country is strong enough to play with Gazprom or with Russia as a whole. And what we can do is try to look over the short-term benefits of such kind of bilateral approach and to think about the common response, because the common response is actually the only way for our countries to be more self-confident in dealing with China, I think.
This is, you mentioned something very interesting, and as we are approaching the closing of our panel, I would like to also ask Alexandra if she has a similar impression. Yasen mentioned that and it's been happening often. For instance, with respect to Russia, Bulgaria was sometimes seen as the Trojan horse within the European Union for Russia. And it's been able to thwart some of the European initiatives. I'm thinking of South Stream. I'm thinking of how South Stream was instrumentalized to undermine Nabucco, for instance, as a project to diversify supply away from Russia. But at the end of the day, Bulgaria has overall been a loyal player within the EU and NATO, and when it comes to strategic decisions, I think Bulgaria was mostly on board, despite these separate instances where it didn't exactly toe the EU line. You represent in Brussels a Central European think tank based in Bratislava, and I wonder, because the same has been said sometimes about Slovakia, that is too pro-Russian, very often about Hungary. Is your feeling, Alexandra, that the Central Eastern Europe will continue to have a hard time working with Brussels in a unified way and finding common ground with Brussels when it comes to China? Or do you think that the feeling that you were mentioning earlier of increasing caution, of increasing awareness, that maybe things are more complicated than they seem, is going to actually perhaps reduce temptation for bilateral relations, bilateral arrangements, and anything that might fundamentally make us uneasy about the relationship with China?
Let me just say first that I agree almost entirely with what Yasen said with regards to the narratives, the alternative narrative, and I don't think that, in my view, China is trying to project its narrative against the West or the Western way of life, but rather as an alternative that is functional, that works, that proved to be very efficient in, for example, fighting COVID. And I think that there is a bit of difference when it comes to narratives coming from Russia in that regard. Now, my colleagues that work on democracy and resilience at GlobSec have been publishing for quite some time a report where we are surveying the attitudes and perceptions in Central and Eastern Europe called GlobSec Trends. And we have seen indeed that not just Slovakia, but across the board, we have more favorable opinions towards the relationship with China, and there are no necessarily highlighted worries that China is an enemy. That is according to the 2019 data. and also with regards to Russia, Central and Eastern Europe tries to always play the idea of a bridge, and that's particularly the case of Slovakia. Now, I do believe that these perceptions are very important, and the battle for winning hearts and mind will continue to be carried out also at the national level, from issues related to language, to cultural affinities, to track record when it comes to democracy, and so on and so forth. So that will continue to be carried out through various entry points, probably very specific for each of the country in the CE region. However, when it comes to realizing or awakening to the fact that China is one of the global powers, and in order to have a fair and an equal relationship, we need to have a European-wide approach or even a transatlantic approach to deal with Beijing. I am quite confident that policymakers in Central and Eastern Europe will not hesitate to come to the table and find middle ground in their conversations with their Western European counterparts to ensure that EU is moving forward as a bloc. And here at stake is not just the future of the EU or the internal market, but we are talking about an ever-increasing insecure global landscape, threats and challenges related to climate change, related to the digital and technological advancements that are way beyond a specific border or a specific country. So I am confident that even though it will take some time, and the EU talks and negotiates a lot until it comes to a common position, there will be more and more moves forward and European-wide strategies in ensuring that our needs and interests and values are the ones that are leading this relationship.
Thank you, Alexandra. If there are any questions from our live audience here, then this is your last chance to ask them, and otherwise we will shortly close the panel. So if anybody wants to ask anything, should now. If not, I think we've had enough questions for you, and thank you very much for agreeing to answer to the best of your ability at a time when I think the prevalent feeling, and if this sums up fairly what I've heard from the speakers, we are only at the time when we're trying to figure each other out, both Europe and China. From the US side, I think in a way things are look more predictable, that the feeling of competition with China is going to continue to prevail no matter who is going to be leading the next American administration. In Europe, I think it's good, given the speed at which the European Union is moving in general, and how things are moving in Brussels. I think what the pandemic has done was to speed things up a little bit in our realization that we have to come up with a common ground, and that even though sometimes we might not see eye to eye, or we might not agree on many of the aspects, we still have to negotiate among the now 27 members to come up with a unified position, because size matters, as was said here when it comes to China, and hopefully the same is going to be true in our region, which is somewhat, and we've seen this, Zsolt was emphasizing it earlier, our region is particularly vulnerable, not just to economic shocks, but also perhaps to political influence. So hopefully all of these things together are going to start us thinking more seriously and faster about how to treat China together as the global power that's probably not going to replace the hegemony of America, but it's going to put up a very serious opposition or alternative, as Alexandra was saying. Thank you for this very interesting discussion. The panel will remain online in its recorded version. And I can again re-emphasize the fact that you can also, if you go to our digital analysis platform, which is www.eastern-focus.eu, you will probably see many more articles on this topic from now on, because this is something that we intend to cover for the months and years to come, for sure. Thank you again for those of you who are here physically with us in Râșnov, and those who are with us from Brussels, from London, from Sofia, from Budapest, and all over the world, and hope to see you soon again in both your physical form and virtually. Thank you again. Have a good day.